Hi everyone, Father Lane here. Welcome to another class in our course on the prophetic literature, and you can see today we are at Yankee Stadium in the Bronx. We've left Queens, where we were in our last video. We've taken the 7 train to Grand Central, changed trains, and now we have taken the 4 train north to Yankee Stadium. It's appropriate that we're at the home of the Bronx Bombers, as today we look at the book of Joshua. We look at this book that focuses so heavily on how Israel inherited the land. There's a lot of war. There's a lot of winning going on for Israel in the book of Joshua, just as there's a lot of winning going on in Yankee history. Although, as we will see, there are a couple of significant losses, and if you want to torment that Yankee fan in your life, simply bring up the 2004 American League Championship Series, or even the last couple American League Championship Series they've been in. They might well get angry at you, but that's another conversation, not going there right now. The book of Joshua. As we look at the book of Joshua today, we're going to proceed in 3 parts. We're going to begin with looking at the outline, the broad synchronic survey of the book of Joshua. Then we're going to look at what can we infer from its structure and from the choices that the inspired author makes. And then finally, we're going to look at some of the ongoing questions that remain about the book of Joshua. You can see our outline of the book of Joshua, which I'm borrowing from Bowling's article on the book in the Anchor Bible Dictionary. This book proceeds in 3 main sections, and the first thing you notice just glancing at the outline is that this book is a theology book. Before anything else, the book of Joshua is telling a story about who Israel understands itself to be and about who Israel believes its God to be. We learn the most important thing by glancing at the bookends of the book, the very beginning and the very end. At the very beginning of the book, we learn whom not to fear. This verse here, Joshua chapter 1, verse 9 says, I command you, be strong and steadfast. Incidentally, that expression, be strong and steadfast, occurs 3 times in the first chapter of Joshua. It says, do not fear nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. Notice how much theology is in that one sentence. Do not fear. The implication is don't be afraid of the other nations. Don't have military fear of other nations, because the Lord your God is with you. And isn't that important? It's saying something about God's immanence, God's presence to his people, and moreover that he is Israel's God. He is protecting Israel. So the book begins by telling us what not to fear. The end of the book tells us what to fear. I have to concede this is a different verb for fear, but still, fear the Lord and serve him completely and sincerely. Cast out the gods your ancestors served beyond the river and in Egypt, and serve the Lord. So in summary, the book of Joshua is all about not fearing other nations and fearing the Lord God, obeying him completely. After all, God brought his people into the land, and as we shall learn, he can take them out of the land. But it's not just about fear. The book itself, as we go back to our outline, the book itself talks a lot about preparation for the land. We'll notice in the first 4.5 chapters that alongside the military reconnaissance effort, there's a lot of discussion about how Israel worships the Lord. Most notably, at the beginning of chapter 5, Israel celebrates Passover before entering the land, and that's significant because the Passover celebrated their release from Egyptian slavery. It's fitting that they celebrate their great freedom feast right as they enter their land of freedom. They also stop receiving the manna. As we look at the warfare sections, chapters 5 through chapter 11, whatever theological difficulties arise with that, and we'll get to that a little bit later on, these are holy wars. The Lord is leading his people. The Lord is showing great care and concern for his people, and as we're going to see, there's significant exception where a foreign nation is able to be spared even amid the warfare. Then we get to this middle section, chapters 12 through 19, 8 chapters of a book that has 24 chapters. That means 1/3 of the book is focused on the distribution of the land. Notice finally how the last 5 chapters focus on various provisions for keeping Israel free. Chapters 20 and 21 focus on things like the cities of refuge, the rights of the Levites, as well as a summary of how the Lord is true to his word, and also how Israel can avoid civil war. When we get to Judges, we'll see what a problem that is. But then the last 2 chapters are simply about covenant faithfulness, about how Israel maintains its freedom as long as it upholds the covenant, as long as it upholds its end of the bargain. So moving from our look at the outline now into big question number 2, what can we infer about the book of Joshua? And the first thing I would suggest comes from that distinction we talked about last time between narrated time and narration time. 1/3 of the book is focused on the distribution of the land. The book of Joshua sometimes has the reputation of being violent and then boring. The first half is violent, you've got all the wars, and then the second half is boring. You've got all of this distribution of the land, and people just say, what does this matter? But we should defer to the inspired author's judgment of what's interesting. Notice the prominence of the northern tribes, especially the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, the two sons of Joseph. The prominence that those two tribes are going to have in the northern kingdom when the kingdom eventually splits north-south after the time of King Solomon. Even in the warfare chapters, a disproportionate amount of the time is spent on northern cities. Finally, chapter 24, the covenant renewal takes place at Shechem, a northern city. So there's some prominence here for the northern tribes. A number of scholars suggest that the book of Joshua thus dates at least substantially to the period of Josiah in the late 7th century BC, because it was during that time that the Assyrian Empire had waned and the Babylonian Empire had not yet waxed, and Josiah was seeking to take advantage of the power vacuum so as to reunite the southern tribes to the land that had been conquered by the north back in 722 BC to reassume authority over that land. That may be true and it may not, but it's at least an interesting suggestion. We can also make some inferences from the main characters in the book of Joshua. The two most prominent characters, obviously, are the Lord, who is presented as both transcendent and powerful. He's the one who wins the military victories. He's also immanent. He dwells in the ark. He's going before the people. He's there with them. So we have the Lord. Joshua is ever faithful. He's the mediator. He gets deceived by the Gibeonites in chapter 9. That's one thing. But he is a hero. Other characters that are significant are the foreigners, who are generally portrayed as evil, with two major exceptions. We have Rahab and we have the Gibeonites. The Gibeonites are one of the nations that lives within the Promised Land. According to Deuteronomy, they were to be exterminated, but they pretend deftly to be instead foreigners from a distant land who would have been allowed to stay alive. And so Joshua ends up making a covenant with them. He promises peace, shalom in the Hebrew, to them, and he makes an oath to them. Even once the plot is discovered, they're allowed to survive. Now, it's unclear whether we're to think ill of Joshua for that, or if whether we're to think, nope, the Lord allowed that. At the very least, no one gets punished for it in the story. So the book of Joshua is heavily exclusivist. It's focused on Israel as being the chosen people and those other nations as the people God didn't choose. But the Gibeonites prove an interesting exception, as does the prostitute Rahab, who welcomes the spies in Joshua chapter 2. She is spared, and indeed she's mentioned in the infancy narrative of the Gospel of Matthew. So this brings us to big question number 3. What are the ongoing questions we have about the book of Joshua? And there really are 3. The first concerns history. A number of the events narrated in Joshua are difficult to reconcile with the archaeological record. This has been a challenge for at least the last 100 years. Scholars continue to ask the question of how historical is the book of Joshua? It's a narrative. As Catholics, we believe it's divinely inspired and thus true. But what kind of truth is it trying to tell? We're just going to take Joshua as a narrative that's trying to tell us something and draw what we think might be the most likely conclusion as to what it's saying. Our second 2 questions, one deals with violence and the other deals with philosophy. The holy war passages, which we've glossed over, they are very difficult, especially in this day and age, especially after the Holocaust. Also, especially after all of the violence that was perpetrated during the colonial era. Here in the United States, the book of Joshua was often used to justify manifest destiny. We recognize now that that interpretation is not a good one and indeed has caused a lot of harm. One of the challenges that we in biblical scholarship have to constantly rise to is to recognize that the Bible is authoritative, even if it's been poorly used often in history. And this brings us to a last question, really a philosophy question, posed well by Pope Benedict XVI. Pope Benedict says, "Revelation is suited to the cultural and moral level of distant times, and thus describes facts and customs such as cheating and trickery, and acts of violence and massacre, without explicitly denouncing the immorality of such things. I encourage scholars and pastors to help all the faithful to approach these passages through an interpretation which enables their meaning to emerge in the light of the mystery of Christ." That is our task. We're not going to finish it quickly, but we're going to do the best we can. Until we meet again, read well and pray well.